Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. Maller Grodner Attorneys, providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. LawMG.com. IU Alumni Association, connecting IU's network of alumni and sharing the Indiana spirit through scholarships, advocacy, and volunteerism. Alumni.iu.edu. IU Center for Rural Engagement, extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. Rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.
Coming up on Indiana Newsdesk. Months after a victory at the nation's highest court, an Indiana resident is still fighting to get his car back. Ahead, the latest in a case challenging the state's controversial civil forfeiture laws. The Archdiocese of Indianapolis isn't backing down from its decision to fire a married gay teacher.
And it's not about orientation here, it's about a situation that may be contrary to the church's teaching that we are addressing.
But those opposed to the decision aren't backing down either. And you might call it a case of the little engine that couldn't.
This train has been under a guillotine in Indiana for many years.
We take one last trip on the Hoosier State Line and head to Michigan to see how a similar train keeps chugging along. Those stories, plus the latest news headlines from across the state, right now on Indiana Newsdesk. Welcome to Indiana Newsdesk. I'm Joe Wren. Well, an Indiana resident who won a U.S. Supreme Court victory earlier this year in a case challenging police seizures of personal property still doesn't know if he'll get his car back. That's a decision that will likely come from Indiana's Supreme Court. As Barbara Brosier reports, justices heard oral arguments in the case this morning.
Police seized Tyson Timms' $40,000 Land Rover more than 5 years ago because they say he used it to transport a few $100s worth of drugs. It's a process called civil forfeiture, which allows police to take personal property they suspect was involved in a crime, even if someone is never charged. Timms challenged the seizure, arguing it was disproportionate to the crime.
It's not about getting my truck back, for me. That hasn't been the case for me for a long time. For me, this is principle. They shouldn't be able to do this to people.
The U.S. Supreme Court took the case up after Indiana's Supreme Court ruled it wasn't clear whether the Eighth Amendment's ban on excessive fines applied to states. The nation's highest court ruled it does. So Timms' attorney went back before Indiana's Supreme Court today to argue police taking the Land Rover was excessive.
They would treat, under the excessive fines clause, Pablo Escobar the same way they would treat Tyson Timms.
But the state of Indiana says the excessive fines clause doesn't require seizures to be proportionate to the crime, and that police were justified in taking the car because Timms used it to transport drugs.
It is not a test that is designed to discriminate based on the type of property involved. It's designed to get at the property that is, as tradition would have it, is the guilty property and get it out of the criminal enterprise.
There's no timeline for the court to issue a ruling. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Barbara Brosier.
The Archdiocese of Indianapolis is defending a school's decision to fire a married gay teacher. Cathedral High School officials say the Archbishop made clear it had to cut ties with the teacher or separate from the Catholic Church. A crowd gathered outside of the Archdiocese of Indianapolis yesterday to protest the firing.
One person should not be fired based on how they're born and how they live their life.
Students organized to press the church to change policies they say alienate certain people, but the Archdiocese stands by its decision, saying the policy applies to all of the schools under its umbrella, covering 38 counties and nearly 70 schools. Now, with us to talk about this is Steve Hennefeld. He's an education writer and former reporter. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Joe.
So there are two schools in the headlines about this issue. How are each one are kind of dealing with this in a different way? How?
Well, two recent schools in the headlines, Brebeuf Jesuit School declined to fire a teacher who was in the same-sex relationship, and as a result, their relationship with the Archdiocese of Indianapolis has apparently been severed. Cathedral High School complied with the expectation of the Archdiocese that they terminate or suspend, I believe terminate, a teacher in a same-sex marriage, and that's the expectation for schools in the Archdiocese. Rebuff is in a little different situation because it's a Jesuit high school, so it still has a religious affiliation, some would say a Catholic affiliation.
So schools under the Archdiocese receive a lot of funding from the state through vouchers, so they are in part publicly funded. Given that, do they have an obligation to serve everybody?
You know, that's really a good question and a good topic for argument. I would argue that schools that receive public funding have at least an ethical obligation to serve all of the public, including and to employ people who, to not discriminate in their employment practices or in their enrollment practices. But the law does allow them to discriminate, in fact, even though they receive voucher funding.
So Catholic schools only got a portion of the $161 million in voucher funds that the state gave this year. Evangelical schools also get voucher funding. Can you tell me a little bit about those schools?
Yeah, I would say that the Catholic schools overall across the state get a majority of the funding. I think 92 million out of 161 million, 38 million in the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. But there's a lot of funding also for evangelical schools, also for Lutheran schools. And, there's not a central policy for those types of schools. Certainly some of the evangelical schools make it very explicit on their websites that they don't approve of homosexuality, they don't approve of same-sex marriage, of different gender identities, and they expect students and families, and I would assume also employees, to sign a statement of faith, typically a fundamentalist Christian faith, in order to participate in the school.
Very briefly here, is this something that's a state issue, or is this something that needs to be taken up in the religious sector?
I would argue it's a state issue. It's something the legislature has briefly tried to address, but chosen not to address. But the state is responsible for how state funds are spent, and there should be a real state discussion about whether this is appropriate.
All right, Steve, thank you very much for being here today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now for headlines, we go over to Barbara Brozier, who has the latest on this week's top stories.
Thanks, Joe. Bloomington residents gathered this week to watch the second round of the debate between Democratic presidential candidates. Many were looking forward to hearing from South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Despite his growing popularity, he has faced criticism for his response to last week's fatal shooting in South Bend of a black man by a white police officer. Buttigieg was careful when addressing the issue.
It's a mess, and we're hurting. This is an issue that is facing our community and so many communities around the country. There's a wall of mistrust, put up one racist act at a time, not just from what's happened in the past, but from what's happening around the country in the present.
Now, he sidestepped pointed calls to fire his police chief, calling instead for a time when white and black people would react the same way when confronted by police. Bloomington resident and city council candidate Ron Smith says he feels Buttigieg hasn't responded to the issue as well as he could, but he's confident in his ability to remediate the situation.
He needs to reach out to the black community, and he needs to find some common ground and try to forge some understanding.
Buttigieg, a 37-year-old gay former military officer, is 4 decades younger than Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont and former Vice President Joe Biden. Buttigieg framed his candidacy as a call for generational change in his party. The next Democratic primary debate will take place in Detroit at the end of next month. Indiana Attorney General Curtis Hill will have a Republican challenger next year if he runs for re-election. Zionsville attorney John Westerkamp announced his bid this week. Hill is seen as vulnerable because of allegations he groped 4 women last year. John Westerkamp mostly sidestepped questions about Hill, but he did say this.
I think the distractions around the Attorney General office is not good for the state of Indiana, and we need new leadership.
Republican leaders have called on Hill to resign, though Hill remains defiant that he's done nothing wrong. Westerkamp's platform is largely the same as Hill's. He focused on opposition to abortion and robocalls. Republican convention delegates will decide next year who gets the GOP nomination. The Environmental Protection Agency's internal watchdog says the agency is misleading people about contamination in Franklin. Last year, the EPA found cancer-causing chemicals were contaminating sewer lines and some homes. But on its Cleanups in My Community website, the agency says health exposure and groundwater issues at the old Amphenol industrial site are under control. The EPA Office of Inspector General says the agency has refused to update its website. The EPA says it's still reviewing the Inspector General's report. Indiana business, faith, and law enforcement leaders gathered in Indianapolis this week for a forum to discuss immigration in the Hoosier State. Panelists discussed a recent study on immigration in Indiana that shows immigrants are more educated than other Hoosiers and contribute to economic growth in the state. Bloomington Police Chief Mike Dekoff says there's a lack of trust between his officers and the immigrant community.
That lack of trust comes from what I believe to be federal government immigration policies and how the discussion has been pushed down to local law enforcement agencies being responsible for that, and that's just not true.
The immigration study, co-authored by a researcher at Ball State, shows immigration is helping to balance a declining population in many Indiana counties. Immigrants made up about a quarter of Indiana's population growth from 2000 to 2015. But the research shows a lack of work visas is affecting that and sending many qualified applicants to other countries to find jobs. A clinic to treat substance abuse disorders is scheduled to open Monday in Columbus. Joe Wren reports the new center could serve more than 100 patients from 10 Indiana counties in its first year.
The Columbus Regional Health Treatment and Support Center, or TASC, plans to offer comprehensive behavioral support for those in addiction recovery. Program manager Katrina Applegate says the center won't have a waiting room. Incoming patients will participate in individual and group activities as soon as they arrive.
We know how important it is when somebody decides that they want to be in recovery. You have a very short amount of time for that person to really stick with that decision.
Medical Director Dr. Kevin Terrell says the center also plans to offer family programming by meeting with a therapist in a group setting. Terrell says they're also working on recovery housing and workforce reintegration.
The nation's highest court ruled yesterday it cannot decide whether legislative districts unfairly drawn to benefit a political party are unconstitutional. Many Indiana legislative leaders have used the Supreme Court cases as a reason to hold off redistricting reform. Indiana activists say the court's decision means lawmakers can no longer use it as an excuse to ignore redistricting. Lawmakers will draw new legislative districts in the 2021 session. In Brown County State Park and its overnight facilities are back open 10 days after heavy rainfall spoiled the drinking water source. The park's water officially passed safety tests yesterday. The park's lodge, campgrounds, and cabins are back open, but some trails remain closed because of storm damage. And man, that storm, a lot of places still recovering, Joe, from the damage, the water. At least it's dry now, for now.
Yes, and I'd say if you're going out, check the DNR website to make sure no matter where you go this weekend that you're good to go.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Barbara. Coming up next on Indiana Newsdesk. The Hoosier State Line will end its run from Indianapolis to Chicago this weekend, leaving another hole in public transportation for Hoosiers. And we look at how investment in light rail lines in nearby states has kept the trains running smoothly. These stories and more right here on Indiana Newsdesk.
The WTIU WFIU news team connects Indiana to the world. We bring you the top news of the day on radio, TV, and online. We round up the stories that have people talking each week and dig deep into the issues that affect your community the most. The WTIU WFIU news team is where you are and telling your story.
10,000.
15? 15, you think?
20, 21,000?
600.
20. 18.5.
24.
It's at least 40.
Look at it.
4,500,000.
650.
20.
650.
This textile would be worth about $500,000.
$500,000?
No way.
I knew it. It's just a blanket.
Laying on the back of a chair. Well, sir, you have a national treasure.
Wow.
A national treasure. Congratulations.
I can't believe this.
Welcome back to Indiana Newsdesk. The Hoosier State Line will make its final trip from Indianapolis to Chicago Sunday. The governor eliminated $3 million in annual funding for the route in the two-year state budget that starts July 1st. Now, reporter Barbara Brozier is following the story. And Barbara, what does this mean for Hoosiers?
Well, they can still take another Amtrak route called the Cardinal Line from Indianapolis to Chicago, but the train originates in New York and only runs 3 days a week. Riders say that doesn't meet the demand for a train back and forth to Chicago. Others argue the numbers speak for themselves.
We are standing here in Indianapolis Union Station, the very first Union Station in our country.
Indianapolis's Union Station opened in 1853, the first of its kind in the country. Its central location made it a natural hub for travel. At one point, more than 150 trains arrived and departed from the station daily. While the building may look similar from the outside today, the train travel it was built to support is drastically different.
Here we are, crossroads of America, right in the middle of everything, and we really need to pick it up a notch in order to be competitive.
Starting in July, only one passenger rail line will make the trip from Indianapolis to Chicago because of the state ending its support of Amtrak's Hoosier State Line.
It's kind of crappy because the train is needed for transportation, especially people that don't have cars, you know, and need to get from state to state like in a quick 3-4 hours.
To me, it was a great disappointment, really. The state of Indiana should have intercity train travel. For that to work, it needs to be higher frequency. It needs to be a priority for the state, a priority for Amtrak.
Have your ticket ready when you get a seat.
But the Hoosier State Lines faced problems for years. Amtrak data shows ridership is down by about 25% since Congress pulled federal funding for regional trains, and the state started subsidizing the service in 2013. In 2015, Indiana entered into an agreement with Iowa Pacific to provide train equipment and maintenance, while Amtrak would operate the route. The deal meant more amenities for riders, including a glass Superdome and a dining car. While ticket sales increased during the first year under the agreement, the number of riders still dropped. And the partnership ended in early 2017 because of a contract stipulation that meant Iowa Pacific got less money each time its on-time performance improved. Now the line is back under Amtrak's control.
Coach is up and to your right.
When I rode the train on a recent weekday morning, only 67 people got on board. Amtrak officials say those numbers aren't surprising.
This train has been under a guillotine in Indiana for many years. And during this time, we've continuously told INDOT, as we've told the communities on the route and the advocates, there needs to be investment in this route for this route to be successful.
Officials from the Indiana Department of Transportation declined to do an interview for this story, but released a statement saying, despite improvements to on-time performance and upgrades to the travel experience, ridership growth has not materialized. As a result, the Hoosier State remains one of the most heavily subsidized passenger rail services currently operating, with about 75% of the cost of each ticket sold subsidized by the state and local governments. This financial model is not sustainable in the long term and doesn't represent the best value for taxpayers. The end of the line has many smaller communities along the route worried about their futures. Crawfordsville Mayor Todd Barton says having a train from his city to Chicago helps attract new companies to the area. He understands why the state pulled funding, but sees the decision as short-sighted.
We really have to think in terms of what's going to position us for, into the future.
He'd like to see Indiana follow the lead of other states and create a separate department for passenger rail travel, rather than including it in the Department of Transportation. He says that would position train travel as a priority for the state. Without that shift, Barton worries the Hoosier State Line will be gone for good.
When a route disappears, it's very hard to get it back.
Amtrak officials say there's a lot of truth to that statement. The rail cars currently serving the Hoosier State Line will be redeployed once it ends. And without the route in place, there's no guarantee that certain tracks will be available in the future. Amtrak only owns about 17 miles of rail line in Indiana, so it has to work with other railroads in order to operate between Indianapolis and Chicago. And that can be expensive.
Bringing the train back as it was is not anything we would suggest. In order for the train to come back and be the kind of success we've had elsewhere in the Amtrak Midwest network, it needs to be a better service. To be a better service, it needs to have investment in it.
That's what advocates for passenger rail would like to see too. They're encouraged by the state's investment in improving the South Shore commuter rail in northern Indiana, and hope it signals a willingness to invest downstate.
What I really want to see is improvement here for central Indiana and for the south of Indiana as well. We've regularly spoke about what we call an inverted Y, which would be a daily reliable service between Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Louisville, Indianapolis, Chicago.
With already limited service between Indianapolis and Chicago getting scaled back to just one line, it's hard to imagine that kind of robust expansion anytime soon.
Now, there are also concerns about how the line ending could impact Amtrak's Beech Grove maintenance shop, which employs hundreds of people just outside of Indianapolis and services rail cars from across the country. Amtrak used the line to transport equipment for repair to Beech Grove, but won't be able to do so as frequently with the line ending. Amtrak says that could make Beech Grove less competitive for contracts, but Joe, it's unclear at this point how many jobs could be impacted.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. And Amtrak officials say Indiana is jumping ship on the Hoosier State Line before it has a chance to be successful. They point to Michigan as a state that's reaping the benefits of a long-term investment in rail. The state isn't losing money on its train service. In fact, it's making a small profit. But as Adam Pinsker reports, Michigan transportation officials view the line as something they need to provide to allow people to get from one place to another.
Amtrak says it is possible for states to fund most of their rail routes, just like they do for the Pierre Marquette line, which is going through Michigan, Indiana, and terminating in Chicago. We're in St. Joseph's, Michigan. We're about to find out if ridership on this line is popular. Camelia Pesena's 2,000-mile trip to Truckee, California begins here in St. Joseph, Michigan.
Right now we go to Chicago and change trains there.
Pesena is among a couple dozen passengers boarding the Chicago-bound Pierre Marquette. She lives just 15 minutes from the station, so taking the train is much more convenient than driving or flying from the nearest airport in South Bend, Indiana.
Oh, it's just a nice way to travel, and we have a sleeper car, and you just sit back, and meals are provided. You can walk around.
The Pierre Marquette runs daily from Grand Rapids to Chicago's Union Station. That's 181 miles, exactly the same distance between Indianapolis and Chicago via Amtrak's soon-to-be discontinued Hoosier Line. From there, passengers can connect to destinations all over the Midwest and beyond.
We have the same seat size on the Hoosier State that you saw on the Pierre Marquette, the same food service that on the Hoosier State that you saw on the Pierre Marquette, and the same Wi-Fi.
Under federal law, states must provide a majority of funding to Amtrak for lines shorter than 750 miles. The state of Michigan spent $4 million on the Pierre Marquette line last fiscal year. Michigan transit officials say their funding of the Pierre Marquette line equals out to $41 per passenger a year, but they make some of that money back through ticket sales and concessions. The Pierre Marquette was nearly full on our trip to Chicago last week.
It's evident with the number of people that are on the train that a lot of people are using it to get to Chicago, so I hope it stays available and it's a reasonable travel price.
And it isn't just vacationers. We found passengers who use the Pierre Marquette line because driving simply isn't an option.
I had a brain injury 7 years ago, and so it keeps me from driving in busy city traffic.
Amtrak spokesperson Mark Maglieri says the investment states make into Amtrak is more than just the operating costs and train upgrades. The money goes to rail and station improvements that can last decades.
No matter how wide you make the highway, it'll probably get filled up. It's cheaper to put money into rail than it is into highways. Rail improvements can last 10 or 20 years. You can see how long it takes for pavement to wear out and them to keep coming back and renewing all that.
Maglieri says while Michigan's partnership with Amtrak is a success story, he wonders if Amtrak underestimated how difficult it would be to keep Indiana on board with its deal.
People just don't understand how this can work because culturally, if the Cardinal comes through there in the middle of the night or late at night and early in the morning, people never see it.
And while Michigan promotes its rail service along busy stretches of highway targeting drivers who are stuck in traffic, Maglieri says Hoosiers never really got a chance to understand how the Hoosier State Line worked and how they might be able to use it. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Adam Pinsker.
That's the end of this program, but our work continues online as we cover the news throughout the week at WTIUnews.org. Have a great weekend.
Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. Maller Grodner Attorneys providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. LawMG.com. IU Alumni Association connecting IU's network of alumni and sharing the Indiana spirit through scholarships, advocacy, and volunteerism. Alumni.iu.edu. IU Center for Rural Engagement extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. Rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.